Alright, what's going on everyone? It's been a while since I've done one of these on the channel, so I figured today we take a look at solving this dashboard component challenge from WebDev Daily using Vue 3. Now, although this is a fairly small component, it offers the ability to practice a handful of Vue's fundamentals. Now, if you want to try and solve this challenge along with me, just head over to webdevdaily.io, you can find that link down below in the description, and sign up for a free account if you don't already have one. Now, once you have your account created or you signed in, you'll just want to head over to the dashboard component challenge, and again that link will be down below in the description, and select on start challenge, and this will take you to the challenge dashboard. From here, you'll have a few options. You can either opt to use your framework of choice and upload your solution, or give it a go using the basics inside of the browser editor. Now below this, you'll have the ability to download the PNG to reference the design, and if you're a pro member, you can also download the Figma file. And once you submit your solution, which we'll do later on, a screenshot of your work will be generated and displayed here as well. Now, to get started before we jump into coding, I like to start by analyzing the design I'm going to be building to get an idea of how I want to structure it. So looking at this design, the main thing that we have is going to be this table. Now, although in this design we only have this one specific table, to get some practice working with Vue, we could create a reusable table component. And this is going to allow you to work with some of Vue's fundamental features such as props and slots. And in addition to the table component, I also see another component that we could create, which is going to be for the status badge that we have nested inside of our table. And in this design, I think that's about the only two things that I see that we can componentize, but again, these are going to allow us to work with some of Vue's fundamental features. Now, if you do want to attempt this challenge yourself, be sure to pause the video here and give it a go, and in the next part, I'll walk you through my solution. Now, if you do want to follow along with me for this video, I do have the starting files hosted on a GitHub repo, so I'll leave the link down below in the description to that. You just want to make sure you're on the branch called starting files. Alright, so here inside of VS Code, I have those starting files open. So let's just run through the starting template that we have, and we'll start with our package.json and see the packages that we have installed. So we're going to be using Iconify for the icons we need for this challenge, and then we're also going to be using Tailwind CSS for our styling. And inside of the Tailwind config, not a lot going on, just have our content property set up to do the purging, and then we also have a font family that we're going to be using from Google. And within the index.html, this is where we're importing that font over from Google, and then we're using the Tailwind class to apply this font to our entire Vue project. Now, since this challenge did not require multiple pages, I decided not to use the Vue router, so we're going to be working out of the app.vue file for this challenge. Alright, so with that out of the way, what we want to do is install our packages, so we can open up the integrated terminal and we can just say npm I like this, and that's going to install all of our packages. And then we also want to spin up our dev server, so we can say npm run dev like this, and that is going to start that up, and then we can open this inside of our browser. So we're going to be using this main tag as our wrapper for the challenge. Now, if we take a look at the design, you can see that everything is pushed into the center. So what we want to do is have this main tag take up the full screen available, and we're going to set the background color, and then we want to push all the items into the center. So on the main tag, we can apply a couple classes. The first one's going to be min_h_screen, and this is going to set the viewport to be 100vh. And then to push everything in the center, we can use the grid approach. So we'll use the class of grid, and this will set the display to grid. And then to actually push everything into the center horizontally and vertically, we can use a class called place item center. We'll also set a custom background color, which is going to be this pink. And then for mobile devices, we want to set some padding on the left and right, so that way we don't have this component touching the sides of the screen. So we'll use a class called px, and then we'll use the value of 8, which is going to set 32 pixels on the left and then on the right. Now inside of the main tag, we're going to have a div for the card itself, and then we're going to again apply a couple classes. So we want to set the display to flex, then we want to set the flex direction to be a column, so we'll say flex col. We want to set the background color to be white, and then we're also going to set a max width on this to be a max width of the screen large, which is the viewport. So if we hover over this, you can see that it's going to set the max width to 1024 pixels. We want to set this to take up the full width available, so width 100%. And then to help with some overflow issues with the table when you get to a smaller screen size, we also want to set the overflow on the x-axis to be auto, and then we'll apply some border radius. So we'll do rounded, and this will be large, which will be 8 pixels of border radius on all sides. And then we'll apply a box shadow, and then we'll also set some padding around all sides. So we'll say P-7, and this will be 28 pixels on the top, bottom, left, and right. And if we take a look over on our development server, we should see that we now have the start of our component push into the center of the screen. So now that we have the structure of our component all built, let's begin to work on this top section. So within this div, let's just create an additional div, and this is going to store that header information. So we'll do a div, and then again, we'll apply a couple classes. So on this, we're just going to set the display to flex, and we don't want to mess with the direction because by default, the flex direction when you set the display to flex is going to be a row, which is what we want. And then we're just going to apply some margin on the bottom here of the value of 8, which is going to be 32 pixels on the bottom to push us away from our table when we get around to creating that. Now within this div, we're going to create an additional div. We don't need to apply any classes, it's just going to be a wrapper. Then we'll have our H2, and then we'll apply a couple classes to this. We'll set the font size to the class of 2XL, which is going to be 24 pixels. We want this font to be bold, so we'll say font bold. And then we also want to apply some margin on the bottom, so we'll do MB1. And then for the value, we're just going to copy this in. This will say transactions. And beneath this, we'll just create a paragraph tag for the helper text, and we'll just apply a class of font light, which is going to change the font weight to be 300, and then we can just paste in that lorem ipsum. Now beneath this, we just want to create the button for the see all transactions. So what we'll do is we'll have a button, and then we'll apply our classes. So we'll set the display to be flex, and we want to align all the items to the center. And we also want to apply the class of self start to align the start of this button to be flex start. Then we're going to have a gap property to have some separation between the text and the icon. So we'll use a class of gap1, which will set 4 pixels worth of gap. And then we also want to set the margin on the left to auto to push us all the way to the right hand side of the actual div that we have set to flex. And then we also want to set a text color, which is going to be a custom color of this purple. And within this button, we're going to have some text content, which will wrap inside of a span, and this will say see all transactions. Now for the icon, we're going to be using Iconify, and I'll leave the link down below in the description to this specific icon. But what you want to do is select on your component, which is going to be view, and you can alter the size and color if you want, which I've already set this to be 1.2 EM, and then the color, which is going to be that purple we pasted in. And then all you want to do is select on, or you want to click on this, and it's going to copy to your clipboard. And then back inside of our application, we can just paste that in, and now we have our icon. But I believe the last thing you want to do is actually import the icon component, so we can just copy this. And we'll say import, let's just push it to a new line. Have our brackets, we'll say icon, and then you want to import this from Iconify/view. So if we save that, you should see now we have this heading portion all completed, and our icon from Iconify is also being displayed properly. All right, so next we're going to create our table component. So for this, you want to come into our SRC folder, and we want to create a new folder, and we'll call this components. And then within our components folder, we want to create that new view component, and we'll just call this base table.view. And then within our base table component, we just want to do the command vbase, and this is going to provide us all these snippets. And we just want to say vbase3ts setup to create our view boilerplate with the script setup and also the language of TypeScript. And just as a personal preference, I actually like to have my script tag above my template. And then since we are also using Tailwind, we can remove the style tag as well. Now for this table component, we want to make it as dynamic as possible. Now we know what the table is going to look like in this particular challenge, but we want to assume that we want to use this component for other types of data as well to create different types of tables. So to do this, we're going to have this component accept some props. So what we'll do is we'll use the define props macro. And the first prop that we're going to define is going to be for our table rows, so we'll call this rows. Now for the type of this prop, it's going to be an array of objects which can have any property as long as it is a string, and the value can be anything. And this is going to allow this component to be dynamic and accept any sort of row data that we may want to pass it for different types of data sets that we may want to use this component for. And the second prop that we're going to define is going to be for our table columns, so we'll call this columns. And again, this is going to be an array of objects, and we're actually going to create an interface for this, which will be called column. And to save some time, I'll just paste it in above our define props. And this interface is going to require an object that has a key property that is a string. And then to keep this component again dynamic, we're going to allow them to pass any property that they may want within this interface as long as the property is a string and the value can be anything. Now for the table, we're going to wrap this inside of a div, and then we'll apply a couple classes. The first one is going to be width full to set the width to be 100%, and then also add a class of overflow x auto to set the overflow on the x-axis to auto. And within this wrapper, we're going to create a tag for our table. And then within our table, we're going to create another tag for the table body. So we'll use tBody. And then within our tBody, we want to create a table row. So we'll say tr like this. Now we'll want to create a table row for each row that we have inside of our rows prop. So to do this, we can use the v-for directive, and then what we'll say is row, and then we also want to grab the index, which is what we're going to use for the key. So we'll say row, and then pass a second parameter for the index, and then we want to say in rows. And then we also want to apply the index for our key, so we can say :key to bind the key to our index. Now within each one of our table rows, we'll want to create another tag for our table data, which is TD for short. And we're going to want to have one of these tags for each column that we have within our columns array. So again, we're going to use the v-for directive, and then we'll use our parentheses because we want to gain access to our index. And then instead of calling this index, we'll just call this sub index like this. And then we want to say in, and then we'll do columns. And then again, we're going to bind our key to that sub index. So on our table data, we also want to apply some default styling. So first off, we're going to set the font weight to be 300. We're going to set the white space to be no wrap. And then we also want to apply some padding on the left and right. We're going to say px6. And then we're going to apply some padding on the top and bottom. We'll say py4. And then we also want to apply some padding on the left and padding on the right to the first and last element, or the first and last table data that we have within each row. And to do this, we can say first of type, and then we can say PL and set this to 0 to get rid of that padding on the left. And then we can also do the last of type, and we can set the padding on the right to also be 0. Now for our table data, we're going to want to have the ability to modify the markup for our table data within the parent that we're using this base table component. And the way we do that within Vue is by using something called a slot. So we can just define a slot tag like this. Now what we also want to do is provide this slot a name. So we're going to make this dynamic, so we're going to bind the name prop for our slot. And then what we're going to reference is going to be our column. And then if you recall, on our column we have a required property called key. So we're going to say the name of the slot is going to be our column, and we're going to use that key property. And what we also want to do is expose our row data from this slot. So how we can do that is by saying :row, and then we can set this equal to our row that we have defined within this v-for directive. Now, when we're using a slot in Vue, we can define what is called fallback content in the event that we don't pass anything for a specific slot. So what we're going to do is, if we don't pass anything for this specific slot, we just want to reference the row, and inside of that row object, we're going to reference a property that matches the column, and then we're going to reference that key property. Now back inside of our main file, what I'm going to do to save some time is just paste in the data that we're going to be using for our rows and our columns. So you can see we have our columns array, which is an array of objects that has a key and then a label. And then what you're going to see is that for each column that we have, which this key, it's going to match one of the properties that we have within our rows. So you can see we have status, type, and then we have type, and so on and so forth. And now that we have our data, we can import and use our base table component. So the first thing we want to do is just import that. So we'll say base table. And then what we want to do is scroll down within our template. And then where we're going to do this is right below this div. Then we'll just import our base table. And then we're going to want to bind up our column and our rows. So what we'll do is we'll say rows is equal to the rows, and then we're going to have our columns, and this is going to be equal to our columns. And now if we did everything right, when we save this and we head over to our application, we should see our table populated with some of our data. And here inside of the app, you can see we have our table data being displayed properly. And now that we have the data structure implemented, let me run you through one more time how exactly this works. So in our slot, we're passing some fallback content because right now we're not defining any customized slots back here inside of the app.vue, which we will be doing in just a moment. But as a fallback, we're going to reference the row, which is being iterated right here, so we have access to that entire row object. And inside of our table row, we're also doing an iteration over our columns prop, so we have access to that entire column. And if we go back to our app.vue, you can see that looks like this, where we have a key and then also a label on some of our columns. So for our fallback content, what we're doing is we're referencing our row, and we're checking for a property on that object within that row that matches the column.key. So you'll notice that right now inside of our application, we're only seeing 4 rows of data, because if we go back to our app.vue, you can see that we have a 5th object right here for our columns, which is an icon, but we don't have anything matching here within our rows array, and that is because we're going to display a custom icon. And I know this still may be kind of confusing, but this is going to allow us to build out dynamic tables using this component with any sort of data structure that we want. Say, for example, we wanted to add another column to our table. So what we could do is just have this key say testing. We don't need to mess with a label. And then within our rows array, we can just add another property that matches this key of testing for a property. So we'll just call this testing. And then we can just say test like this. And if we save that and head back over to our application, you can see that column is now being displayed in our table. Alright, so as you'll be able to see right now, our current table doesn't really match the format of the table that we're looking to build. And this is where we're going to implement the use of some of our slots. Now back inside of our main file, the first thing we want to do is get rid of the self-closing tag and then have a closing base table tag. And this will allow us to define some of our slotted content within our base table component. So to override our table data with some slotted content here inside of our main file, what we first want to do is define a template tag. Now on this template, we want to define the slot that we want to override, and these are all dynamic. So the first one that we want to override, if we look in our columns, is going to be our type data. And after the pound sign, we'll just say type, and then we'll also want to access our scoped content, so that way we can access this row object here inside of the parent. And to save some time, since this markup is quite simple, I'm just going to copy and paste this in. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a div, and we're going to set the display to flex and have the flex direction be column. And then we're going to have two paragraph tags, and we're going to reference our row, and we're going to have the type info and then the type. So now if we save this and head back over to our application and we look at ours, you should now see we have our slotted content being displayed inside of our table. Now, one thing you may notice right now is that our table is not taking up the full width available, and that is because we missed a CSS property on our table within the base table component. So on the table tag, we're going to add a class, and what we want to do is min w full for the min width of 100%. And if we save that, now our table should be taking up the full space available. Now the next table data that we want to override is going to be the price. So the format is going to be identical, except we just want to change out the actual slot that we're referencing. So what we'll do is we'll just copy and paste this in to save some time. And then the only thing we're going to be changing is going to be the slot name, which is price. And then for the content that we want to reference, is going to be the price and then also the date. And the last table data that we're going to override for the moment is going to be the icon. So what we want to do is very similar once again. We're just going to reference the icon slot, but this time we don't need to reference the row. And what we're going to do is we're going to use another icon from Iconify, and I'll leave the link down below in the description to this icon, or you can head over to the finished GitHub repo and you can just copy this icon component. And with that saved, you can now see the table is starting to come together. The last thing that we're going to work on is going to be creating a reusable component for the status badge. So here inside of the components folder, let's create a new file, and we'll call this base badge.view, and then we'll use our snippet to create our view template. And then again, we are using Tailwind, so we don't need the style tag. And then as I mentioned, my personal preference is to have the script above the template. So for this badge component, we're going to have two props, one for the label and then one for the color. So let's start off by defining those. So we'll use our define props macro. And for the label prop, this is going to be a string. And then for the color, this is actually going to be a type that we're going to import. And this is going to be called badge colors like this. And then we'll just import that above our defined props like that. So the colors are going to be either green, red, or yellow. And if you wanted to update this, you could, but those are the three that we're going to be using for our table. So for the badge itself, we're going to be using this div, and we're going to want to apply some styles. So we'll start by adding a few of our Tailwind classes. So first off, we want to set the display to flex. We want to have all the items in the center, so we'll do a line item center. Then we want to have some separation between the actual icon we're going to be using and then the label. So we'll use a gap property of 4 pixels or gap 1. Then for the padding on the top and bottom, we'll say py1 for 4 pixels. And on the left and right, we'll say px3 for 12. And then we want to round the corners completely on this badge, so we'll do the class of rounded-full. And for the badge content, we're going to start off by using another icon from Iconify. So once again, I'll leave the link down below in the description to the specific icon, or you can head over to the GitHub repo and you can just copy this icon component. And since this is a new file, we're going to want to make sure we import the icon component from Iconify. So we'll do icon and then from, and this will be at Iconify/view. And also within our badge, we'll want to display our label, and we'll just store this inside of a span. And back within our main file, we can begin to implement our badge component to make sure that everything is working correctly. So within our base table, we want to override the slot for the status. So we'll create our template. and then we can just define the status. And then once again, we want to grab our scoped slot. So we'll do our row. And then for now, what we can do is we can just say our base badge like this, and that should auto import it for us right there. And then what we can do is we can set the label, and we can set this to be the row.status. Now, right now, you're going to see we have an error on our base badge component because we're not passing a color. And for now, what we'll do is just pass the color of red. And here inside of the table, you can see our badge component is now working. The one thing we need to work on is going to be providing the correct color for the status of completed, pending, and canceled. Now, to handle the theming of our badge based on the three colors that we have of green, red, or yellow, we're going to start off by creating a new variable, and we're going to call this color variance, and then we'll set this equal to a new object. And we're going to provide a variant for each of the three colors that we have of either green, red, or yellow. And to speed things up, I'm going to paste in the configuration. So as you can see, we have a config for each of the three colors that we have for our badges. So for the green config, what we're doing is we have a BG of green 500 at a 20% opacity. And then we have the text green set to 500. And then we have the same pattern for the red and the yellow configuration. And to set the correct color variant based on the color that is passed as a prop, what we want to do is we want to say :class, and then we want to pass our bracket, and then we want to say or reference our color variance object, and then we want to reference the color that is being passed as a prop. So for example, if a user passes the color of red, then it's going to reference this color variance object, and then it's going to reference the red property, and then apply these classes to our div. And here inside of the table, you can see now, since the default color is set for the badges is red, they all have the red theme. Now back inside of our base table, let's output the correct badge based on the status. Now to do this, we want to wrap everything inside of a div, and then we'll apply a few classes. First off, we'll say display flex, and then we want to apply the class of self start to align everything to the start of the div. And inside of this div, we'll just move our base badge, and then what we also want to do is duplicate our badge component down 2 more times. Now to output the correct badge based on the status, we can use some vif and velse directives. So first off, we'll start with the vif, and then what we want to look for is if the row.status property is equal to completed. Now if it is completed, then we want to output the green color badge, so we'll change the color from red to green. Next, we'll use the velse if directive to see if this is not true. Then the next thing we want to look for again is if the row.status is equal to pending. And if the status is equal to pending, then this will be the yellow color badge. And then lastly, we can just use the velse directive, because at this point, if this is not true and this is not true, we only have 3 statuses, then this must be the canceled status, and then we'll have the color of this badge be red. And now back here inside of our table, you can see we now have the correct color variant being displayed for the 3 different statuses. Okay, so to get our design a little bit more accurate to what the challenge was, we're going to add a border to the bottom of each one of our rows, and then when you hover over the row, we're going to change the background color. So for this, we're going to have to make a few adjustments to the CSS. So within our main file, on the div that is wrapping our entire dashboard component, we want to remove this padding that we have around all sides. And then on the heading where we have this class of flex and margin bottom 8, instead of having a margin bottom on the 8, what we want to do is have padding around all sides of 8. And the reason why we needed to do this is because if we were to add the border or the hover effect with the previous padding around the card itself, then the border would not span all the way across from left to right. And by adding the padding to each individual section, it is going to allow us to do that. Now within our base table component on the table row, we want to apply a few styles. So first off, we want to add a hover effect. So to do this, we say hover : and the style that we want to apply. So we're going to change the background to a gray of 100. And then we want to apply a border on the bottom to each one of our table rows, but we also don't want a border on the bottom of the last one. So what we can do is do last of type, and then say border, and then do none. And then lastly, we want to add a cursor of pointer. Now, because of the way we're changing the padding, we actually don't need to have this first of type and last of type on our table data. We can remove this, and to match the padding that we have around all sides, we want to update the padding on the left and right from 6 to 8. And also looking at the design a little bit more closely, I think the padding on the top and bottom should also be 6, which is going to be 24 pixels. And now if we take a look at our component, you can see that it's going to match the design a little bit better. So now we have this border on the bottom, and when we hover over, we have this nice hover effect. Alright, so with that, I think we're about all complete with our dashboard component. The final thing that we want to do is upload our files to GitHub and then deploy this component to a free hosting site like Netlify or Vercel. And then once we have that completed, we can head back over to WebDev Daily and submit our solution. Okay, so I went ahead and deployed our application over on Netlify, and then I pushed out the latest files to the GitHub repo. So back on WebDev Daily, we can now go ahead and submit our solution. Now, since we opted to use our own editor, we want to select on Submit, and then we want to provide the repository URL and then our deployed application. So we can head over to GitHub and copy this GitHub repo link, and then we can paste that in there, and then we can head over to our Netlify app, we can copy this, and then paste that for the challenge URL. And for the description, I already have one written out, so we can just paste that in there like this, and then we can select on Submit Challenge. And once it has been submitted successfully, you should now see your solution within the challenge dashboard, along with a generated screenshot from your deployed application. Alright, so that's going to wrap it up for this video. Hopefully you found it helpful, and if you did enjoy it, be sure to leave a like on it down below and subscribe if you are new. And if you haven't yet already, be sure to sign up for WebDev Daily. It is free, and we have over 260 challenges just like this, and we add a new one every single Monday. But anyways, thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Take care.